and a lot of other work we have done, in particular looking at this issue from an external perspective. But before we start, I'm really happy to be with a very, very knowledgeable and distinguished panel. Florian Pennings from Microsoft. Maybe when you start your presentations, you say also a few words about yourself. Rasťo Kužel from MEMO 98. You're specialized also on media monitoring. Miroslava Sawiris from Globsec. I think Globsec is known here to everybody. And Gajdoš from the Slovak Ministry of the Interior. So what we would like to do in this panel is not to repeat everything that you heard in the first panel, but to drill down in some of the issues that we have not really, let's say, have the time to discuss in more detail in the first part. And I think we still miss one discussion that we did not have in the first panel is, we touched upon it when we came to content-based or actor behavior-based issues, and that is, what is actually disinformation? Who is defining this? Where's the line? What is legal? What is illegal? And I like to very much the term disinformation which is not illegal, so double negation, which tells you already how tricky it is, you know? But I will not kind of put forward our definitions, our own approaches, but I think it's clear to everybody that disinformation is not necessarily something that has to do with false information. It is about framing, it is about using certain information, it's about putting the context also in a way. So we should be very careful in using terms like fake news. I think nobody here in this room is using this anymore. It is a political term that is used in different contexts. Maybe I just put forward 3 elements that we like to see in that, and then I would ask the panel to give their thoughts on that. Really think about 3 elements that are crucial to define, not to define in academic terms, but to define whether we have a situation of disinformation. And that is, there needs to be a clear intention behind this. There's a lot of information out there which is wrong, which is hyper-partisan, etc. Sometimes it's just kind of innocently, let's say, distributed, but there's not the intention behind of misleading. The second one, and that is for me the crucial one, is a coordinated approach as well. A lot of individuals, a lot of politicians also individually doing things in this area, but they're not necessarily coordinated. And the third one is there needs to be a clear objective, an aim, either a commercial or a political aim behind that, and of course it needs to be harmful, or at least potentially harmful. So this is kind of the first thought, but as I said, let's maybe first turn to the panel, give a bit their thoughts on what is it actually that we're looking at. Who are the actors that we can identify? And that is already difficult enough. We heard from the blurring line between internal, external, kind of how do we define this exactly? And then we would kind of, on the panel, develop a bit further, and then of course have the discussion with you as an audience as well. I would like to turn to Miroslava to kick off. I know you have a few slides, if we can put them off. And then I would give you the microphone to give your view or your introduction.
Great. Thank you very much, Lutz, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for having me. It's always good to be able to, discuss the issue of information operations with an expert audience and just contribute to the discussion. So my name is Miroslava Sawiris. I work as a research fellow within the Strategic Communication Program within the Globsec Policy Institute. So let me just switch my hands because this doesn't feel natural. So yeah, I have a presentation on disinformation, but first I would like to basically start with a bit of context. Okay, how does this work? Do I just do it? No? It's this. This one? Oh, yeah. Yes. So just to give a bit of a broader context on the information environment that we live in currently. As has been said in the previous panel, the way we consume information and everything has changed very rapidly. So some data from Eurostat here shows that basically in 2007, 55% of households had access to internet. 10 years later, it's already 87%. Okay, so we see this massive intake and use of internet. That's the first thing that really changed the way we operate and communicate. And second one is the digital platforms. So as of 2018, Facebook allegedly had 2.3 billion active users. Now, we don't know how many of these are real ones. Some of them will be perhaps fake. But you know, they have also large user bases on WhatsApp, Messenger, and then you have a plethora of other digital platforms. Some of them are already sort of waning, some of them are already just growing. For example, Instagram as basically the digital platform for the young ones. So as has been also said in the previous panel, digital platforms became massive mediators and curators of all sorts of content. And then we speak about all these, you know, massive volumes of content that they basically have to process every day. And the question is, the way they process it, the way the algorithms that process it for us and personalize it for us actually impact on the way we understand and consume information. So what has happened within these last few years is basically that digital platforms have become the go-tools for social communication and political communication, and hence this affected a lot of things in the way we deal with information. So for example, we as users became large producers of data and content, but on the other hand, we don't have that long, attention spans to be able to actually process all that information. So these has implications. And the implications are the fact that we can't really distinguish between what is important and what isn't important anymore. And the engagement figures on social media sort of became proxy for this kind of distinguishing between what's important and what isn't. Now, the trouble with that is basically that we see the content on our news feeds in a personalized way, because we have these recommendation and relevance algorithms which basically create sort of echo chambers and filter bubbles which lead to increased polarization. And then, of course, as has been already said, we have the content that is sensationalist, which travels the fastest. So in other words, sensationalist content gathers the highest amount of engagement figures and it travels really fast. And this implicitly basically promotes more radical content online. And so then we have to deal with the shareability of news, of this kind of news, which basically the shareability is the proxy for distinguishing what's important, but also the shareability of our personal data, which then can be harvested for, for micro-targeting and political campaigns. So this section I'd like to end just with this quote from Zunstein, who already in 2007 said that the internet will basically divide us into digital silos, where we will only hear the echoes of our own voices. So I find it quite interesting that he already, perceived this in 2007. So, but where does the disinformation or information operations fit into this picture? So basically, this kind of digital platforms and information environment that we currently live in enable us to basically spread disinformation very effectively and very cheaply. So, but first of all, I think often we speak about disinformation, but really what we mean is something broader, something like, information operations, because disinformation is just one tactic, it's just one way of achieving public manipulation or public polarization. So, here are just a few examples that some of them we actually have been able to capture in our European election study. So, for example, character assassination, smear campaigns, and then you have manipulation of facts, you have amplification of divisive narratives, you have dissemination of propaganda and conspiracy theories, you have gathering of intelligence, on your target, because before you disseminate this information or start doing any kind of information operation, you will tailor that kind of content to the audience that you want to target. And obviously you have hacking and then manipulation of that hacked material, which is very kind of sophisticated method. Or you can deploy, you know, organized troll factories, or you can just use disinformation. So really, for us at Globsec, disinformation is only one aspect of information operations. So I have a few examples from our recent Slovak presidential election, which happened in March, and then also the EP elections. So this is a typical example of disinformation. This was a story published or picture, digitally altered picture of our now serving president, Mrs. Čaputová, where, as you can see, her profile has been altered in a way to suggest that she's got Semitic features. This was published by a famous pro-Kremlin disinformation outlet. They also have a magazine which they publish, I believe, on a monthly basis. The post on the left side is also from them, and it says, you know, the first sentence says, "There's Jew behind everything." So this is something very clearly anti-Semitic. Also, currently, the owner of this magazine is facing some prosecution in Slovakia in relation to similar types of content being posted or produced by them. But what I wanted to say by this is that, you know, this kind of story perhaps wouldn't be relevant somewhere, let's say in Portugal or other country, which doesn't have that kind of historical baggage that Slovakia has as a result, you know, of the Second World War. But in Slovakia, where 52% of population believe that Jews have too much power, according to Globsec public opinion polls, this kind of data manipulation actually can be very efficient at you know, polarizing society even more. This post has been then taken down because disinformation is also becoming more, you know, we can identify it quite easily. It's easy to point at this and say, okay, this is manipulated. That's easier than, you know, saying that, as we have been saying, that, you know, that manipulation of facts, for example, is much more sophisticated, and you can't just ask somebody to take down their content that's probably just hyper-partisan, but doesn't, you know, it does it do harm? You know, it probably does, but we can't actually, you know, that's the issue of free speech that we will probably touch on as we go. So we also monitored these divisive narratives during the election. And the spike that you see there around March is basically when this liberal candidate Zuzana Čaputová, at the beginning of the campaign, she was completely, you know, unimportant. So the disinformation scene or the information operations scene, whatever you want to call them, didn't really perceive her as a threat. But once her ratings in public opinion polls started to grow, so, you know, started the narratives on election interference. So they started to prep their audiences, you know, in order to claim that, look, even if this lady wins, the election has been manipulated and it hasn't been free and fair. The same thing happened after second round of the election, when the anti-system candidate, Štefan Harabin, didn't manage to succeed in getting into the second round, and he filed constitutional complaint, claiming that this election, you know, has been manipulated. And again, these kind of narratives have been reflected and widely promoted on social media. So, in terms of goals, I'd like to say two things to this, but there are two goals in terms of information operations. The first one can be immediate ones, such as, you know, we have seen here in trying to discredit a particular political candidate. But the second one, the long-term and perhaps even more dangerous one, is the one which actually strives to undermine trust into the democratic electoral processes and democratic institutions more broadly. And this one is very corrosive because you can sort of, you just deploy these kind of narratives over time in different political campaigns, and it just sort of grows. So the tactics which they use for these information operations, even if they are as varied as they are, always, at least from my personal experience, what I have observed is it always works with fear. It always works with some kind of a prejudice, with some kind of a stereotype, which then is being used to drive that polarization. And then it exploits all sorts of, you know, prejudices that exist in that particular society. So I'm moving on now to the EP elections, because the difference between these two elections to me has been quite interesting. So here we see the number of relevant posts that we have monitored on selected social media pages in association with our colleagues in Hungary and other B4 countries. And as you can see, the only country which has been really affected by a strong disinformation campaign was Hungary. But that's also because, you know, the media landscape there and the general situation is somewhat different to the rest of the countries. We also had to include some mainstream media there because they also published disinformation. In Slovakia, Poland and Czech Republic, the impact of disinformation campaign has been just much weaker compared to Slovak presidential election. But we monitored the narratives, and as His Excellency mentioned, the most dominant themes that popped up were migration as a threat, and then the EU, negative portrayal of the EU, you know, the dictate of Brussels, the so-called dictate of Brussels. But if you look at these narratives by country, what you can see is that, you know, these narratives are not deployed equally in each country. So you will see that, for example, the EU dictate was the sort of strongest narrative in Poland, whereas the migration and the threat of migration has been the most often utilized in Hungary. So the key findings from EP elections to us have been that there are different levels of activity, you know, on the monitored disinformation or information operation channels. And in Slovakia, what we have observed is more a skillful manipulation of facts rather than a promotion of divisive narratives, rather than dissemination of you know, straightaway disinformation, which is very easily identified. So I've already mentioned the two new narratives that were the most promoted, but what I would like to briefly touch upon, and I'll end with this slide, even though I have more, but I don't want to take any more of your time, is the diversification of actors. Because it's true that a few years ago, we were mostly focusing on the pro-Kremlin, you know, foreign interference, but now we see a lot of homegrown actors. And it's very difficult to sort of find out what their motivation is, whether it's, you know, financial, or whether they are linked to any kind of actors abroad. The issue of attribution is not easy one, and I don't really think it's got a simple answer. So this is the last slide, which I would like to end with. It's just a sort of a map of different types of actors that you can have that use information operations. And as you can see, foreign state interference is just one of them. You can have foreign non-state interference. For example, the Macedonian youth who in 2016 discovered that by promoting and writing sensationalist content, they can earn a lot of money on ads, you know, and there probably wasn't any other reason behind it. Then you have domestic homegrown. We have plenty of local influential individuals who became, you know, sort of stars of social media and who are very influential. You know, some of them have shares of, let's say, 10,000 shares on Slovak Facebook, which is by Slovak standards a lot. And then you have domestic governmental actors. That's when a country or a government uses these kind of tactics against their own population. And then you also have international, you know, networks or terror organizations. You know, ISIS uses propaganda, disinformation, information operations to target West and also to recruit new members. So that's probably everything from my side.
Thank you, Miroslava. An excellent introduction into the big variety of actors, into something that we should really avoid, and that is to think in the 2016 standards that a lot of people are still discovering this issue, but it has evolved enormously. We will talk about this on this panel, in technological terms, in its, let's say, manifestation as well. And I think that was a good introduction. Now, if you take this slide here, the last one with the interconnection, you will see that if you want to look at this in policy terms, these are very different policy areas. We speak about media policy, we speak about hybrid threats, you know, that's of course something that we looked at very, very closely. We talk about elections, so how do we safeguard democracy, democratic processes? We talk about countering violent extremisms, etc. And we, of course, talk about kind of the cyber crime, let's call it like this, in the broader sense, or cyber issues. You mentioned hack and dump kind of operations are as bad as kind of straightforward disinformation activities with false news. Florian, from a Microsoft perspective, from an industry perspective, you also have a few slides.
Yeah.
I think you will focus a bit more on the cyber side of things, but all this goes hand in hand, of course.
Thank you, Lutz, and fantastic presentation before. Thanks a lot. Let me introduce myself first, because before the slide, there, it says Microsoft on the left top. But actually, when I was asked to be in this panel, I was still working for ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency, where we proactively wrote 2 opinion papers on this topic. Now, I heard that the term fake news is not the right term anymore. We did this in April 2018. So we moved on, and in 2019 we released another paper, and that was called, I think, Election Security and Monitoring. But the main issue is that also from a cybersecurity perspective, we saw the need to respond to look at this threat, or look at this development, or however you want to call it, from a technical angle. And I would like to draw a little bit on that and then move towards Microsoft. So one of the main things I would like to explain, and what was for me very important to put in this opinion paper that we wrote in my time as I was working for ENISA, is to look at the instruments that you have, and this probably is also what you're referring to, the policy instrumentarium that we are in possession of within the EU framework. One of the things is the NIS directive. So we, I don't know if everybody is familiar, it's the Network and Information Security Directive, actually the first kind of cybersecurity law on the EU level to be developed. And we proposed, just a proposal, a recommendation, if you will, to say, let's consider putting political processes and institutions or campaigning to be part of the NIS directive. That means it becomes part of a critical infrastructure perspective. That means that there are also certain things that political campaigns or a political organization, but also parliaments need to do, just as a first push. And this was in 2018 that we launched it. I see the debate has developed, which I can only applaud to. And then moving to Microsoft, so I've shifted, I'm only there for 2 months, so forgive me if I get questions fired at me that I'm not capable of answering, but my background is cybersecurity policy, so that's where I feel most comfortable. But one of the main reasons for me to make the shift to Microsoft and feel confident about going from public to private is that this company, one of the biggest in the world, is doing so much to assist not only political campaigning, but also the welfare and the well-being of cyberspace. Having said that, the world today, I will go through it quickly because then the other speakers have some time, we can go into questions. The world today is not as the world yesterday. We see an increasing rise of cybersecurity incidents. In our perspective as Microsoft, we do see that the incidents are rising, and one of the main things that I would like to highlight here is we see that the role of nation states is increasing. Where I really liked what you picked up on, that you said, okay, we see not only nation states, but we also see it within the state itself, we see different actors. From a Microsoft perspective, we need to take a step back, and we just need to, or we try to have an overview, and we just need to conclude by this time there is an increasing role of the nation state. So we also feel a sense of responsibility. The cyberspace is of us all, but the majority of cyberspace technology is in the hands of private organizations. That means that there is a sense of responsibility. And if there's not a sense of responsibility, we need to engage in public-private cooperation and conversations to discuss why it's not there, and when it's there, or when we are able to create a sense of awareness, what should we do about that? There are a couple of initiatives that Microsoft either is involved in, has initiated, or endorses that I would like to draw the attention on, and then I will quickly sum up and give the floor to the next speaker. So this is a slide. One of the main things I would like to take you through is in 2017, we as Microsoft, we proposed to start looking at cyberspace in a new paradigm and think about things like a digital Geneva Convention, which actually is not the peace convention, but it's think of the term cyberspace and think of the the role that private companies, but also the nation states have. You need to work together to understand what's going on, how can we create a framework in which citizens, industry, civil society is able to continue in free spirit and stability. There's another initiative I'd like to draw out, it's the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, 2018. This is another approach where 30 large companies came together on a global scale and identified a couple of objectives that are there to secure and stabilize the cyberspace. And this goes to a level of creating common norms, where you explain to each other what should we do or what should we not do in case of a cyber attack, what are things necessary at the highest level to be investing in. And you can draw this very low to detailed level, but it first starts with having the awareness at that level to understand, okay, we have a common responsibility because the cyberspace is not only ours, it's not only yours. We need to understand that it's a common activity. Lately, 2018, I don't know if you, this is 2018 November, President Macron launched the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. Another initiative where we're involved in, 50 states have already signed the declaration. We are working on the industry side to get large organizations to sign as well. I think we're currently around 550 signatories and still working on it, because we do believe that these are the ways to move forward. And to conclude, and this is maybe to refer back to what we're discussing here, the Defending Democracy program that Microsoft has developed. And this is one of these things that I really felt comfortable in making the shift from ENISA to Microsoft on a personal note. They are really investing, or we are really investing in protecting campaigns, developing, safeguarding elections, and to do a certain level of disinformation defense. Will this be the 100% answer? Of course not. But it does show commitment and investment to be involved and to help each other in creating a solution to this threat. I will keep it. I will stop here, full stop, and looking forward to discussing and give more security.
Thank you, Florian. I think key takeaway is, in any case, this needs to be a multi-stakeholder, whole-of-society approach. I think this we can conclude before the conference is over already, because we know that this is nothing that governments can do alone, that industry can do alone, that civil society can do alone. Rasťo, from your perspective of an NGO, you looked specifically at elections as well and aspects of democracy. How can we grab this issue? How can we define it so that it can develop proper policy instruments around?
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Not an easy question, but I'll try perhaps just to give you a bit of a background. I'm an election practitioner. I've spent the last 21 years basically looking at elections, observing them pretty much globally, as you can see with these little dots, and that's actually focusing on the role of media during elections. So we started as an observation group focusing on traditional media, and we were quite fine because we had solid methodology. We had a wonderful job, watching television, reading newspapers, and someone is actually even paying you for that. But then came 2016, and everything changed because we could ignore social media by that time, but we couldn't do that anymore. And then you also asked about the disinformation. Obviously we have seen a lot of examples of disinformation previously in almost any election campaign, particularly when you travel east of Vienna, you would find a myriad of different types of disinformation that was used. So what has changed now is actually the means. So I would say that disinformation is an old wine, but in a new bottle. So now we have a very efficient way to amplify disinformation. And given the changing media environment, it can reach people instantly, and it can reach millions. So if we in '99, if I saw a complete fake issue of one newspaper in Ukraine, which was circulated to 400,000 people, now you know, disinformation that is produced on social media can reach millions and can reach them instantly. So I think this is the first sort of basis that indeed disinformation is something that was here for many, many years. What has changed now is the means of how this disinformation is spread. So perhaps it's not only, of course, the content that we have to focus on, but we have to focus on the message itself and also on the messaging, how this is actually amplified. So what we have tried to do, I mean, after 2016, we tried to take the basis of a comprehensive methodology which we used previously for traditional media, and we try to put it in the structure of social media monitoring during elections. For this, we have been working with Democracy Reporting International, and we have also received funding from Civitates to produce a digital toolkit. Basically, to try to see to what extent social media impact on electoral integrity, particularly looking at these negative but also positive tendencies. So very briefly, in our methodology, we look at the messenger. So these are the political actors, but these are also the traditional media and their social media pages, and also the category which was used before, influencers. So we have new category of digital influencers, people who have quite a big support online, and I think they are also relevant to look at. The second focus is on message. So these are the narratives which are spread, and for example, during the EP elections, we saw the change that has been already mentioned, that it's not so much external, but it's internal actors who are spreading divisive narratives, and the topic of migration was used as an example. The third category hasn't been really mentioned here yet, and this is the messaging. So these are the ways how the messages are amplified. You know, these are the bots. You know, the inorganic ways how the message is being spread. So basically, I will just go through this rather quickly to save more time for discussion. But we only try to look at the election integrity. You know, we completely recognize that disinformation is not a matter of 1 month before elections. So here we divide it on this chart. You can actually see the impact of disinformation from a longer-term perspective. So from a longer-term perspective, you know, this is polarization, attacks on democratic institutions, political apathy that you can create by spreading these type of messages. From medium-term perspective, it's the discrediting campaigns, divisive narratives, information aimed at confusing voters, and also micro-targeting, which I think is extremely important to focus on. I think quite often in this community of actors who are focusing on disinformation, we do not always focus on micro-targeting, but I believe that data protection is a key issue of focus when it comes to this type of medium-term perspective. And then a shorter-term perspective, I mean, this could be voter suppression, this could be questions about electoral integrity. I mean, you have a very good example with President Trump, that in my 20 years election experience, that's the first time I saw that the winner of elections was complaining about manipulations during elections, yeah, and was calling elections fraudulent. So, to wrap up, we are running now 5 monitoring projects in Austria, Portugal, Poland, Romania, and Croatia. This is where we are testing this digital toolkit. The main goal is really to have some real-time understanding of what is happening on social media platforms, and providing important feedback not only to governments, to policymakers, but also to platforms. I think this is the key issue. The last thing which I wanted to mention, I mean, here are just examples of what we did during the EP elections. Miroslava already mentioned that the topic of migration was something which was worth noting. In Hungary, we saw that it was the third most promoted issue by political parties. And here, in this case, it was mainly the ruling party Fidesz that was promoting this. What is interesting to look at is what was happening actually with this topic when you look at the reactions and shares and emotions. So it's a divisive topic. It was the most engaged topic by those who were basically by the followers, by those who were sharing this topic. So it is just a confirmation that this is one of the most divisive emotional topics. The last thing I wanted to mention is basically in order to be able to have some kind of comprehensive research, we are facing the same problem as Lubos already mentioned during the first panel, which is basically access to data. And this is something which exists. This is something which media do have access, for example, to CrowdTangle on Facebook, and that way they could actually gather historical data which is necessary to have comprehensive research. We see the tendency that is to limit, to restrict access to data, and I think this is one thing which I think I would like to bring it to the level of EU. I think we need more support for civil society organizations to have access to data, to be able to come up in this area. I think we still need more and more research to be done to have some more relevant results, but we need access to data. I will leave it here and be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you very much, Rasťo. I think this access to data issue is one of the top priorities here. You heard it from Paolo, you heard it from me, you heard it from many people. The question is exactly how do you kind of prescribe this? Where do you anchor this? That might be kind of the point that we can also discuss in a moment. And that is very often then put into a opposition with data protection, so with GDPR rules, for example. So when we discuss with platforms and with others, they always say, you know, we cannot give you these data because all this is GDPR rules. I guess, Martin, GDPR is also part of the Ministry of Interior or Justice, both of them, I guess. If you look at the elections in particular, I guess you made a quite detailed kind of analysis of what happened, but what are preliminary conclusions that you draw already for public policy from your perspective?
Thank you. My name is Martin Gajdoš. I work for the Department of Elections at the Ministry of Interior, and before that I worked for the State Commission for Elections, which was created in 2014. So it's kind of a new highest level body, election management body. So for the last 5-6 years, I'm in the direct process of the elections. So briefly, I want to connect my input with Miroslava's presentation. I guess you could have seen that election interference narrative is on the rise in this disinformation scene, let's say. So that's pretty much a new thing in Slovakia, because traditionally we have, for the last 30 years, we have a pretty high level of public trust in electoral process. So it's really like interesting to me to see that, because before we were used to candidates attacking each other with disinformation, sometimes with truths as well, but like election integrity was not an issue. So I would like to give you one example of like clear-cut case of disinformation attacking the integrity or trust in elections. It was during the presidential elections day. Around halftime of the elections, there was a post on Facebook by the known disinformation media group, and it was a post that said that 100,000 voters' licenses were falsified. Voter's license is a piece of paper that gives you the right to vote anywhere in any polling station, not just in your permanent residence polling station. It's not just a regular piece of paper, it has watermarks and every safety precaution. You can't just print it out, it's not that easy. So for the regular person, it's impossible to falsify. Was this disinformation? This is a pretty easy case because it's easy to say it was. It had no basis, no real basis, no indication this is true. But this media has around 85,000 followers on Facebook, which is a lot in Slovakia. So this was brought up by the member of the State Commission for the party that is usually portrayed as kind of right-wing party. It's at least controversial, but it has a member in the State Commission because they have the members in national parliament, so they have a right to nominate the member. So he brought this up. So the first question is this and the disinformation? It is, okay. So what should we do with it? What would you do? It's my question to you, or maybe to the audience, what you think is the best approach to this. We discussed this, and I remind you, it was the middle of the election day, so you have to act quickly. So we discussed it, and what we did was nothing. Okay, it's not that simple, but pretty much. Okay, that was a kind of a joke. So
it's very hard to just do nothing and see.
Well, we did nothing in a way that we didn't present it to the public. Like chairman of the State Commission or our director of the department could have a press conference and address this, but they didn't, and we decided that this is the best approach to not create panic and maybe disseminate this more, because somehow it didn't create a lot of attention on the election. It was an issue after the election, and one of the candidates actually used this in his complaint to the Constitutional Court, which is still pending, so it was not yet decided, and I think it's it has no chance to be successful, but we will see. So, but apart from doing nothing, we did, of course, some precautions. So we did some random checks in random polling stations to count the voters' licenses, and we accessed the information of how many vote licenses were issued by the municipalities, how many were used, and etc. So we found nothing of any interference, no problems, no irregularities. Every checked voter's license was the correct one. So there was no indication that these allegations are true. So it was completely false information. So clear-cut case of disinformation attacking the integrity of the election process. And after the elections, we actually, State Commission filed a criminal complaint to the prosecutor's office, and it was handed to police. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, we received the answer from the police department, which said that there was nothing wrong with this information. Well, we thought it was pretty much it could be seen as criminal offense of disrupting of elections, which is a criminal offense, or dissemination of false alarmist message, which was which I think was capable of creating like panic in the electoral in public. So they decided it was okay. So it was a very short decision, and in my opinion it was wrong, but what can we do with it? So the one thing I get from this is we need to be prepared for this situation. We have no guidelines for this anywhere. I think Globsec is working on it right now, if I'm not sure, your colleagues. So we need this. And one other thing, there is no mention in electoral laws in Slovakia of the internet. Like in the electoral campaign law, there is one mention of internet, which is completely outdated and not useful at all. So right now maybe I will get back to this a bit later, but now we in our ministry we created a working group. It's at the start it's a very small group, but we are planning to make it a little larger, and the main issue is to create a new legislation for the online campaign, and there is a little bit of disinformation and hoax and hybrid threats issue in that as well. But it's really hard to put this in legislation, especially from the point of election management bodies. Like, it's really hard to create a body who will oversee this, who will decide what is disinformation or what is not, and it's really hard to regulate online platforms, without the infringing on the freedom of speech and everything. So it's really hard. Okay, so let's. Yeah. Thank you,
Martin. Thank you very much for that insight. It's extremely interesting to see. If you discuss this in an academic kind of forum, as kind of the easy answers, the easy ways, sometimes we need to regulate the platforms, we need to do that, we need to do that. The moment you get deeper and deeper, this is extremely complex and also quite tricky in certain parts. But we'll come to that in the discussion. Let me just ask you a bit provocative question here on the panel, and then I'd like to open the floor. And the provocative question is actually, yes, we speak about disinformation, yes, we speak about fake news, etc. But does it really matter? Is there really an impact that we can measure in the sense of that we have voters that are changing their behavior? Is there a real kind of something that we can see, that we can document or not? I know this is provocative because we are struggling with the same question. I would maybe go the same round. Miroslava.
So yes, it's extremely difficult to answer your question simply, and I don't believe there is a clear-cut way to measure this, because there are always many other factors which come into the equation. So you can't actually say that, oh, this person has voted for this, far-right extremist group because he read some disinformation online. We can't actually make these kind of conclusions. But in Slovakia, we do have public opinion polls, that Globsec conducts on a yearly basis. And the one in 2018 was focused on conspiracy theories. And we don't have enough comparable data yet. But in that edition of Globsec Trend, you would find quite astonishing numbers and proportion of people believing in different kinds of conspiracy theories, and also this one that I've mentioned about Jews having too much power, or another question was about do you believe that secret societies are conspiring to create a totalitarian world order, and that also in Slovakia gathered over 50%. So because we are a bit late, because we didn't conduct this kind of opinion polls perhaps earlier, we don't have comparable data yet, but eventually in time we will be able to sort of at least have a proxy measure of how much disinformation out there and conspiracy theories are believed. But also, what I want to say is that in Slovakia we have a lot of you see this kind of alternative media scene seeping into the mainstream politics. It becomes part of the mainstream political discourse. It's being deployed by leading political personalities, and then they disseminate this message and they amplify it so much more because people actually listen to them. So obviously, again, I'm going to say the same thing as I've said. We can't measure it exactly, but we see the impact simply by this being used already in mainstream politics, and political points are being earned on it. So to some extent, it must be working in that case.
Okay. Thanks. This indeed is a tricky question. I don't think you can identify or formulate a very clear-cut answer. You can't. I think you should, or we, and this is again in a multi-stakeholder approach, need to think about a constant effort that we all have, a constant responsibility. It starts with education. Educate the children, but also educate the seniors. If I look at my grandmother, I don't think that she will understand what's fake news. She will not understand this term, let alone disinformation. So this reaches all angles. So as a very simple answer, it's a constant effort to create a safe and trustworthy environment, to defend our values of what we call our European democracy. But that's under constant discussion. And that's what makes it also very complex and difficult. And I know that you are doing a great job there, Lutz, with your organization. But it does require these discussions in these rooms. It requires involvement of leading academics, but also it requires the involvement of citizens. One of the small things that I would like, for example, I really think that the EU Code of Practice on disinformation is one of these good examples that you allow players such as Microsoft to sum up what they have done to protect citizens and industries and civil society against disinformation, and start from there. But it's an ongoing discussion, and we can't stop. Thank you.
To answer your questions, is it possible to measure the impact of disinformation? No. I don't actually believe that we will ever be able to precisely measure the impact of disinformation the same way as we are not able to measure the impact of campaign on the election result. I mean, we know that if you do a bad campaign, you are not probably going to win, most likely, but if you do a good campaign, does it bring this amount of votes or that amount of votes? I mean, let's look at the US election 2016, which has been probably the most researched election in the history of elections so far. Do we have a definite answer there? We know that there was certainly some disinformation, but did it swing the vote? I mean, obviously, I think what is important from a research perspective is to understand the differences in electoral systems. So if you have a majoritarian system where the result is decided by a margin of few votes, yes, disinformation could play a big role, but are we ever going to be able to measure it precisely? No. Does it matter what we do? It does matter. I mean, we are not in the same situation as before 2016. People are more aware of these things. We are discussing this issue. Has been pretty much on the agenda. Do we need to improve, the approaches? I mean, of course we do. I mean, of course, as someone has mentioned, it's such a multi-stakeholder challenge that it involves so many. I don't remember sitting in one room with so many different professions, going from cybersecurity, to elections, to technical industry, in any of the previous discussions I have had. So I think it does matter. We have to continue digital media literacy, focusing on seniors and also first-time voters. I think this is essential. very briefly, if I may, to that disinformation in Slovak elections. This is one reason why we need to also step up the technology disconnect of EMBs, of election management bodies. We clearly need rapid reaction units to deal with this type of disinformation. In the United States, you had a similar or different disinformation, which was like your polling station number has changed. You are not voting in where you used to vote, but you are voting in a different place, and then you have to react, you know, to this. I mean, so I understood the approach. Doing nothing meant that you didn't want to amplify the message, you didn't want to bring more attention to that, but maybe under different circumstances, maybe there should be some kind of response which is relevant to the gravity of the offense, you know. And certainly, I agree with you. It is clearly a violation, and it should have been dealt in that way.
Okay, so yes, there is a very clear need to have guidelines for this, like when to do nothing, when to do something, when to do what. Like it's very clear now, but who is going to make these guidelines? Like I think it should be us, with connection with other parties and other ministries and public even, but it's really hard to regulate these things. Like my work in the working group that I mentioned, we want to approach the public opinion polls. That's one of the things that is very strong tool to approach voters and to create some opinion in public. Like it has very strong appeal to voters, what they see, what percentages they see. So right now in the national parliament there is a novelization of the election campaigns law, and right now we have 14 days silent period for the public opinion polls. It looks like that members of parliament will up it to 50 days. So for 50 days, almost 2 months, there will be no public opinion poll presented to the public. So that's like the easiest and I would not say smartest approach to regulate something. Like I'm going to just forbid it. So right now I'm personally working for because we don't have a definition of the public poll, like nowhere in our laws. So right now I'm working on some definition. I'm not an expert on this, so it's just like something I have to create myself, and I look to other legislations in Canada. They have pretty good legislation for public opinion polls. So we just want to create some standards for it as well, like how it should look like, what information should public get, not just the percentages, but what was the question asked of the respondents, what was the number of respondents answering the questions, every information we can get to people, and some bigger groups in Slovakia already do this. So Focus, you know them. So they on their page they have every information you want about their public opinion polls. So and back to other things we said. I think one way, and it was said in the previous panel. I think one way to regulate this is to put responsibility on the online platforms, not just on candidates and political parties, because they are part of the problem. They are main players in the disinformation scene, like political parties and political elites that should maybe have a positive input on people to not believe everything they see, but they just use the misinformation and disinformation for their own goals. So we need to put pressure on the online platforms, and I think we will in the next new regulation for online election campaign.
Good. So, extremely complex, we know this, but I think we spent a lot of time in analyzing the issue and looking how the issue is morphing and changing, but of course the real challenge is now to translate this into real action. If I can make 1 second of promotion for our own kind of approach here, and our means in that case the European Union. I think with the action plan against disinformation, even if it has a horrible title, it is actually real avant-garde approach how to tackle this issue, because we're not coming from one issue only. We take 4, 5, 6 policy areas together and kind of piece it together in a better understanding of the issue. You know what a lot of you here in the room as researchers are also looking at, in understanding how quickly this is morphing also, because otherwise we cannot do any public policy about this. Also exposing what we know, showing, you know, we do a lot on one specific external actor, but we should do more about these things. Just objectively, this is going on. The second we didn't speak about is really kind of connecting also. I mean, all this knowledge in the member states is still untapped, you know, there are pockets kind of, and we need to connect governments, we need to connect civil society, we need to connect the industry, and we need to connect internationally. You spoke about the Canadians. I think the Canadians do an excellent job. Really, we can learn a lot, vice versa. So this international kind of learning from each other is extremely important. Internet or kind of social media platform, well, let's not call it regulation, but kind of engagement and regulation and more is of course crucial. And then this very big and important cluster is awareness, education, empowerment of civil society. I think this is how we want to approach it at EU level. I get sometimes a bit of criticism, yeah, this all sounds good, but you don't do enough. But actually, we do a lot and more than other people. Sorry, this was the 1 minute kind of commercial block for the EU approach to this. We'll come to questions, please. Is there a mic? Otherwise, I will. Thank you, Martin. Okay. And please identify yourself so that people know.
My name is Miroslava. I have following the European elections since 2014. First as a fact checker, and then mostly a fact checker involved with internet literacy, because the problems are at that scale as we heard today. All fine, I've been a civil servant as well, all fine the action plan, but how are you going to govern that? That's a very complex thing, and that means urgent actions. I see always just like one piece of thing addressed here and there, and I think we just about survived the 2019 elections. But the challenges are going to be bigger and bigger. So how are you going to govern it inside and transfer? How are you going to engage? Then the media literacy side, the digital media literacy side, we have been warning that don't give that one to the platforms. They don't want to give the full picture on that one. But these are member states, mostly the funding or the competencies as such. And I mean, that's where you get the lasting efforts in the end. But how are you going to govern the whole thing? Just curious. How does it look at the time?
Question. Was that a question to me, or?
Right.
I'm just a humble moderator here. No, in 2 sentences, and it needs much more kind of depth, kind of let's say explanation. But this is nothing that can be done just at EU level of the EU institutions. You know, bring the good policy to everybody. This is where member states, EU institutions, and I repeat it, industry, social, civil society, the different institutions that are involved. This is really a multi-stakeholder kind of approach that we need. And that's why we may need to think in clusters. You know, this is very much where I come from. The area where Florian, for example, is involved in, cybersecurity, the work of ENISA, the NIS directive, and many of these things are as crucial as kind of where people now look at the famous Digital Services Act or not, etc. This is part and parcel of the same thing. We have one vice president in the new commission who has it in her guidelines, in her mission letter. So that's good news, because we have a very clearly identified person at European level, and that gives me, although I'm working on the foreign policy side, but that gives me a lot of confidence that this is really kind of an important issue also for the next commission, for the next setup. Sorry, these are the two quick sentences, but please, questions to the panelists as well. Yes, the gentleman from Croatia.
Yes.
I remember your first question, the first round.
Just a few brief remarks. I mean, again, we are putting a little bit of this, little bit of that in the same pot. Disinformation, one issue. Political campaigns, another issue. I did a research on Trump and his elections, and it's actually pretty decisive. It didn't swing the votes like in traditional political advertising. What it did, it was micro-targeting that made the change. You know, he won the he lost the elections for 4 million votes. I mean, he was down 4 million votes in comparison to Hillary. Come on, let's not stop calling it winning elections. If he was in any European country, he would be really great loser. But electoral system is different, of course, and he won electoral points and electoral votes. How? By where micro-targeting enabled him to do the campaign with surgical precision, just targeting where he needs to win, and allowing him to reach every single person that would support him and mobilizing with the hate and emotional messages those persons to go out and vote. This is science fiction of the elections, what was done in Trump's case. And he is not smart enough. I'm civil society, so I'm allowed to say this publicly. He's not smart enough to pull this campaign together. So it was Robert Mercer on one side, who had his own agenda. There were Russians on the other side, all working independently because all can benefit from Trump. And that is what is happening across the Europe now. We are exposed to this kind of science fiction political engagement and interference with democracies, you know, wherever there is an interest. So what are we doing about that? Let's not talk about the top layer of the problem, which basically we can even fix and nothing will change, because the structure is rotten and we need to fix the structure. So what are we doing about it? And is there any intention to actually focus on what is the problem, not about the consequences of this problem?
Can we collect a few questions and then kind of so that everybody can take out the bits and pieces? But thank you very much for this question, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rasťo Kužel from Slovakia. And just coming to this Lutz moderator key points, that awareness, educating and empowerment, but this the EU strategies. Actually, it comes from all this discussion as well as from our previous research done on this topic, that platforms must be involved, you know, and we have to regulate them, or they themselves must be regulated. So I mean, this is somehow should be adjusted or involved in this area, because it's not enough. It's important, of course, awareness, educating, but really it doesn't work as such. Thank you.
Other questions to the panel, so that they can react. Nobody spoke about how do we balance freedom of speech. James, please.
Yeah, James Cantor from Progressive Media EU Screen. I just wanted to reinforce the question that we heard from behind me about the Mercers and about Trump. I think I'm very interested in, I'd also like to emphasize I'm interested in an answer to that, because how do you take them on? Do we go the distance that some progressive forces have gone in the United States and Britain and use disinformation to counter their disinformation? To what, I just want to be really clear on that. To what degree do we adopt their tactics in order to just get away from the rather stale situation that we're in, where we debate about whether it's right or wrong to repeat their lies when we counter them? It seems like we still need a solution.
Time for action, so to say. Any other question? Otherwise, this is a very big question that I would play back to all the panelists. Shall we do this now the other way around? Maybe Martin, you kick off, so that Miroslava has the last word.
Is it on? No?
No, you can take this one.
Oh, okay. To the first question, it's a very good question actually. Never before we, from the position of electoral management body, dealt with micro-targeting or boosting content, stuff like that, which is a dominant thing on social platforms now. So it is a part of discussion in the working group, what to do with this. Because in general, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing that political party or candidate can reach the one voter or very small group of his voters. It brings voters closer to the parties and in reverse. So what I want to do, or what I imagined would be best, is to approach it like, where is the problem? For me, problem is that one candidate can target one group with one personalized message, and the other group with personalized message that said something completely opposite. Which I think is a problem, because that's like clearly lying to the voters. So I think we should just make it transparent. Like you can micro target who you want, but the message you are targeting with should be made public in some sort of register, or I don't know. It should be maybe It is a question who you want to be responsible for it: social platform, online platform, or the candidate, or ministry. I don't know, because right now we are working on the register. I think it's not secret. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's ever going to be like put in practice, but we would like to create some register for political ads in online platforms. So it will be provided by a ministry. So platforms will be responsible for the information. They will give it to ministry, and we will make it public for the voters. So that's just a project right now. So what I wanted to say, we should not forbid micro-targeting. We should just make it more transparent.
Thank you very much. Well, very good question. I believe that things that worked during the 2016, there were some changes. I mean, dark ads, for example, are not available anymore. Yeah. So, and these dark ads were used to amplify these messages. Then there was another attempt to pass the Honest Ads Act, with which you would have a much better understanding, who is, the transparency of ads, which was also discussed in the first panel. And I would say that yes, dark ads clearly that shouldn't have been allowed. First of all, the problem for me is actually more with the organic content than with the paid content, because we heard from Lutz, I mean, that they were not given the access to all the data either. So of course, unless we have full access and full transparency, we will never be able to decide. But I think what should be done is that the paid content should be clearly labeled, and that will, I think, probably solve that problem. Micro-targeting, huge question. I fully agree with you. I don't fully agree with you that for me it is a problem. It is a big problem, and I wanted to actually help Lutz to answer your question, because I don't want to be only critical about EU. I think there are some good efforts, and I think GDPR, like it or not, be critical of it or not, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And here, I think we should continue. We should do more with the data privacy. We should definitely have that transparency that you are talking about. We should know. There is another Civitatis project which is called Who Targets Me? I mean, which basically tries to put more information in this gray area of how you are targeted specifically with the messages. The other problem is the data protection. The fact that people do not know what sort of information actually platforms have about you. I mean, we saw examples. I mean, of course, don't have to talk about Cambridge Analytica here, but I think this is certainly one big area where we should really focus on. And as I said earlier, disinformation, people who are focusing on this has been still abandoned to some extent, and I think there should be much more focus, particularly on micro-targeting, data protection in this area.
Thanks. If you look at this development of threat from cybersecurity angle, right? Cybersecurity analysts are normally and cybersecurity defenders, how they're called, work in CSERTs and work in CERTs. And within states, you've got each state within the European Union has its own CSERT or CERT, how you will call it. I think one of the things we should explore, and I know that the European External Action Service is already busy there, is to explore how can you educate those first responders to identify what's happening, because it might be that it's notified, and we've got all these beautiful systems in place, and that's one of the main point of my analysis so far, being involved in the EU government over the last 6 years, is we have so many existing policy and instruments already. Sometimes it's good to take a step, pause, look back what we already developed, get into discussions, and again here, I'm like a broken record, but again, public-private, look at those things, get that input back on the same table and start discussing it again. And if you think from this perspective, disinformation, misinformation, and all the different terms we're discussing here, require different angles, but you have already frameworks in place, which is the CSERT network, where ENISA holds the secretariat. Nation states come together, or the member states come together, and they discuss these things, educate that to increase the defense capabilities of these processes. Consider what I said in my opening remarks. Consider if you want to make the political processes and systems, institutions, as you will, part of the NIS directive. Start thinking in those terms, because that's already regulation that's there. And I'm fairly confident if you start to think like that, and then come back to your question, what should we really do? Then the flaws of the system will pop up, and then you can address them in an open discussion. Because this is such sensitive democratic issues that really require time, and we cannot find the solutions within the time that we would like. You need time for this and constant effort. And then the last thing, just to help you out here as well, Lutz, in what you've done. Everybody is very welcome. Now, to look at one of the proposals at the moment being discussed in Council is the proposal on the cybersecurity competence center model. That's one of these things where the European Union has reserved, I think, €2 billion to invest in all kinds of different things. Why not? Because I know there's a lot of academia in the room. Identify this as one of these existing mechanisms that will come into play, I think, 2020, to see, hey, is there some money or budget available to start grabbing one of these topics, as disinformation or election monitoring, and say, hey, how can we put that in a cybersecurity environment, because that's where the money needs to be allocated, and move on from there. Just as an idea, and that, again, drawing back, there's already so much in place. So, thank you.
Right, so I just would like to reiterate from the research perspective the issue of transparency, because I fully agree with Martin and also Rasťo that we really need some kind of measures put in place so that we don't necessarily have to rely on the willingness of the digital platforms to provide us with the necessary data that we need. Because, I mean, a while ago I was at Rasťo's workshop and there were a number of NGOs, you know, from I don't know, you name all the countries that were there, and each one of them struggles with doing actually, you know, the monitoring work, because they struggle to get the API access from Facebook. You know, sometimes they have to jump through like so many hoops and so many months, and literally it by the time you actually get some data, the elections and everything that you were supposed to monitor are gone. And then another issue is also that once you have that access, you can lose it pretty quickly as well. So I don't necessarily think that this should be up to digital platforms to have the goodwill to provide us with this data. And when it comes to also monitoring the micro-targeting and other political advertising strategies, I think the voluntary code of practice is a step in the right direction. I mean, certainly we're better off with Facebook ad library than we were before, because at least I can see some kind of data there. But as a researcher, I can't actually work with a large data set. I have to do all the work manually. I can't compare whether this particular ad, even though it's on the ad library, whether it's actually being put on with a disclaimer. The rules around it are really not that clear. Sometimes you have political ads which cost under 100 euros, which have this little triangle warning next to it that they have been, displayed without disclaimer. All sorts of, little things that really don't add up. So to have that kind of regulation where political parties would be required to list all the ads that they placed, who they targeted, and etc. would be great. And then it would be great to have the same list, like a full list of political advertising from social media companies, so that as a researcher, I could actually compare the two data sets and see whether they match and what are the inconsistencies, and then we could actually see the real picture. Because at this point, it's very fragmentary, and what we have seen, for me, there are so many inconsistencies there. So obviously, yes, we are happy that there is some kind of voluntary transparency in place, but it's not enough, and I'm afraid that certain regulation will need to be put in place. But to answer your question about whether we should answer disinformation with disinformation, I think it's very tempting, but I don't think it's actually the right way to go, because once we would actually just contribute to that kind of atmosphere where you can't trust anything anymore. And that's the primary goal of disinformation, is to actually, it isn't to persuade you this way or that way, it's just to sow confusion. And that way we would basically be just contributing to the problem. It may have some short-term positive effects, but I'm afraid long-term it wouldn't be the right strategy.
Thank you very much. I see the organizers getting very nervous because we need to move to the lunch, and that's why I will not conclude anything specific, but let me please home this point again about you cannot look at this issue just from one policy area. If you look at it from a cyber side, there are answers to certain issues. If you look at it from a media policy side, there are certain answers. If you look at it from an electoral integrity perspective, if you look at kind of foreign policy hybrid threats, there will be answers. We need to combine these answers. That is my firm belief, because very often these panels tend to be quite confusing, because everybody speaks about a different thing and about a different kind of definition also. What is it, and what do we need to forbid and what not, and where do we need regulation, and then pop up kind of easy answers that seem to be easy. But I think there is quite some work to be done. At the same time, it needs to start with transparency, with better understanding, and this is why I think everybody here in Brussels on the institution side would agree with this analysis that you just gave. If we don't know how it works, then we can also not regulate it correctly, and that is I think very much in the kind of on the height of the political agenda. I know you still have a full afternoon ahead of you. Unfortunately, I cannot join you. I know that Tanya will kind of have a leading role in this as well. I would like to thank you, first of all, here on the panel for your insights, the audience, and maybe the message, and if I can kind of do this together with Paolo, because we need also your support, we need your input, we need your active participation. We need you also to speak to your respective governments, because this needs to be done together. And maybe last thing is also to thank kind of the organizers, not only Compact, but also our host here today of Slovakia, because this is so important that there is ownership at all levels in the process. Thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch.
much. It's a pleasure. Oh yeah, of course. They're our colleagues.
Pleasure. Thank you.